The Whispering Rift. Location: White Mountain National Forest, New Hampshire. Approximate year: 2002. My daughter never went farther than the entrance of the granite rift. The other children could still see her standing there. Then she disappeared directly in front of them. She did not walk into the darkness. She did not turn the corner. She did not fall. She simply vanished. 3 minutes later, she appeared in exactly the same place and continued speaking as though no time had passed between two words. She insisted she had never gone anywhere. By the next morning, she knew something she could not possibly have known, exactly what the rift had done to my brother 22 years earlier. This happened in August of 2002 when I was 34 years old. I am 58 now, and after all these years, I still do not know where my daughter went during those 3 minutes. The first time I saw the rift, I was 12. My older brother Daniel was 14. We spent most of the summer of 1980 at our grandmother's house outside a small town north of Lincoln, New Hampshire. The house stood at the end of a gravel road. Beyond the old apple orchard, the forest climbed toward the White Mountains. We could reach the first trails by bicycle in about 10 minutes. The local kids had a few places they liked to show newcomers, but the farthest was the one they called the Whispering Rift. To reach it, you followed an abandoned logging road uphill, then left it for dense evergreen forest. The last few hundred yards barely had a trail. Wet roots crossed the ground. Gray granite pushed through the soil. Old needles softened every step. The closer we got, the quieter the forest became. First the insects disappeared, then the birds. Eventually there was nothing except wind high in the canopy and the occasional knock of a pine cone hitting the ground. The rift lay at the base of a granite outcrop. Two enormous rounded faces of granite projected from the slope beneath spruce, moss, and roots. Between them ran an almost vertical black fissure. In 1980, it was only 8 or 10 inches wide. The passage angled inward, and our flashlights showed perhaps 15 or 20 feet of damp gray walls before it bent downward into darkness. What made the place famous was the sound. If you leaned toward the opening and spoke, the rift gave your voice back several seconds later. But it was never a normal echo. The pitch dropped. Certain sounds stretched. Sometimes the final syllable continued after the echo should have died. The first time I tried it, I shouted my own name. "Matthew!" Several seconds later, something deep inside the mountain answered. "Matthew." It was my voice, but old and exhausted, as if it came from far below us. A local boy named Wes Calder told us that was why everyone called it the Whispering Rift. He also knew an old story. According to his grandfather, a small seasonal native settlement had once existed near the ridge, long before the nearest modern towns. Nobody knew exactly who had lived there. The story said only that they considered the place dangerous. They had not worshipped the rift. They had been trying to keep something from coming through it. Along the edges of the fissure were lines so worn that they could easily be mistaken for natural fractures. On the left was a long, curved groove. On the right was another, almost its mirror image. Seen straight on, the marks resembled two narrow loops facing one another. The black fissure itself seemed to form the missing connection between them. Near the narrowest point was a small circular depression that stayed dark even in direct sunlight. At 12 years old, the symbol interested me less than what the rift did to objects. We threw in a stone. It struck the walls, went silent, then shot back out. Daniel blamed the slope. A pine cone and a bottle cap came back too, but the delay was never the same, sometimes 2 seconds, sometimes 10. I had an old brass compass that had belonged to our grandfather. I had been specifically told not to lose it, which was probably why, at 12, I decided it would be impressive to throw it into the fissure. The compass struck stone twice and disappeared. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. We had just decided it was stuck when it came flying out hard enough to hit Daniel in the chest. The casing was undamaged. but the needle turned slowly in circles, then stopped. It was not pointing north. It pointed directly at the rift. We walked 50 yards away. The needle rotated and kept pointing back toward the granite. By the next day, the brass had turned almost black. The following morning, part of the casing crumbled between my fingers. I buried what remained behind our grandmother's shed. A few days later, we went back. It was a warm, clear morning, and our grandmother had packed apples and sandwiches because we planned to stay in the woods most of the day. Near the rift were broad granite slabs heated by the sun. We sat there and ate. Daniel still had one green apple. Without much discussion, he rolled it into the opening. We heard a few soft impacts, then nothing. 20 seconds, 30, almost a minute. The apple appeared in the darkness and rolled slowly into the light. At first I thought it was a different one. The skin was shriveled and dark. One side was covered in white frost. I touched it. It was ice cold, even though the granite around us was hot from the sun. Daniel cut the apple open. There were no seeds. The entire core was packed with fine gray sand. We did not throw anything else into the rift that day. For several days, nobody suggested going back. Then Scout followed us. Scout was Wes's young beagle, noisy and curious and afraid of almost nothing. He ran through ferns, carried sticks, and circled us all the way up the old road. When we reached the granite, the forest went silent again. Scout seemed not to notice. Daniel threw him a branch. It struck the rock beside the opening. Scout ran after it, stopped at the fissure, and sniffed the air. Wes called him. He did not react. Scout pushed his muzzle inside, then his head, his shoulders, his front legs. We still did not understand how he fit through something so narrow. Wes grabbed for his hind legs, but Scout twisted free and vanished. For several seconds we heard claws scraping stone, then one short yelp. After that came another sound, much farther away than the visible passage could possibly allow. Then silence. We lay beside the crack and called him. Daniel tied a flashlight to a cord and lowered it inside. The beam slid across wet granite, reached the bend, and disappeared. After a while, I heard barking. Very faint. I leaned closer. The bark came again, only now it did not quite sound like a dog. It was lower and stretched, almost like the rift's distorted echo. 18 minutes after Scout vanished, he crawled back out. His fur was dry, his paws were clean, and he was not injured, but his collar was gone. Wes hugged him. Scout did not respond. He only stared back at the fissure. For the next 3 days, Scout barely ate and stopped barking. He spent hours on the porch facing the mountains and growled at his reflection in the glass door. On the 4th night, he tore through the porch screen and disappeared. Rain had fallen overnight, so we found his tracks easily the next morning. They led straight through the forest to the granite outcrop and ended at the fissure. There were no tracks leading away. We never saw Scout again. Wes told his parents the dog had run into the woods after a scent. None of us mentioned the rift. At that age, keeping the place secret still seemed more important than explaining what had happened. Scout's collar was visible just inside the opening. Daniel thought he could reach it. He lay on his stomach and pushed his left arm into the fissure. I watched his fingers touch the collar. Then he screamed. His arm would not move. The granite itself remained perfectly still. Nothing collapsed. The fissure did not close. But Daniel shouted that something was squeezing his arm from every direction. Wes and I pulled him by the shoulders. Nothing. Daniel said the pressure was moving upward from his hand toward his elbow. Then a second scream came from inside the mountain. Daniel's exact voice. Delayed, lower, much longer. I still remember the moment the real Daniel stopped screaming because he heard himself screaming from somewhere deeper inside the rock. For 1 second, all of us froze, and the rift released him. We fell backward. For perhaps 2 minutes, Daniel could not move his left arm. Then his fingers began to respond, and by the time we were halfway home, he could move it normally again. There was no blood, bruise, or pressure mark. We told our grandmother he had gotten his arm wedged between two rocks near the old logging road. Because it was working normally again, she assumed he had compressed a nerve. The strange symptoms came gradually. Daniel could feel touch, but his brain interpreted it incorrectly. Hard objects sometimes felt soft. Cold could feel hot, and warmth could feel icy. His strength and movement were normal. His sense of touch was not. Doctors found no structural damage. One neurologist called it a psychogenic sensory disturbance, what today might be described as a functional sensory disorder, and blamed the combination of pressure, fear, and stress. Most of it improved, but the temperature reversals and brief distortions of texture never completely disappeared. Several months after the accident, something else appeared. One cold morning, a pale pattern formed beneath the skin of Daniel's forearm. Two curved lines, a narrow gap between them, a small point in the center. The same shape as the carving on the rift. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Daniel showed our parents. A dermatologist thought the pattern might be vascular, caused by temporary changes in small blood vessels or abnormal nerve signals. He could not explain why the same geometry returned in the same place and suggested we were seeing a meaningful shape in a random vascular pattern. Our parents accepted that. Daniel and I did not. Because his arm worked normally and the symptoms had appeared gradually, nobody had a reason to hike into the forest to inspect the exact place. We certainly did not volunteer to take them there. After that summer, Daniel never returned to the rift. Neither did I. 22 years passed. Over time, I learned to explain almost everything. Childhood memory is unreliable. Mountains create strange acoustics. Scout could have run away. Daniel could have had an unusual stress-related sensory disorder. Even the compass and the apple slowly became less like evidence and more like memories that frightened me. Then our grandmother died in the spring of 2002. That August, I returned to New Hampshire with my wife Claire and our 9-year-old daughter, Emily. We planned to sort through the old house and prepare it for sale. Daniel said he would join us near the weekend. The place seemed smaller than I remembered. The orchard was overgrown, and the forest had pushed closer to the road. But the mountains looked the same. Blue ridges behind Spruce, gray granite, morning fog, and that smell after rain, wet bark, pine needles, and cold stone. Emily quickly met several local children. I never warned her about the rift. By then, I had spent 22 years convincing myself that frightened children had turned an unusual place into something impossible. I also assumed the old trail had vanished and that local kids no longer knew about it. One afternoon, Claire let Emily go exploring with them, with instructions not to go beyond the old logging road and to return before dinner. They left around 2. By 4, they were still gone. At 4:30, I found one of their bicycles lying near an old trail that disappeared into the trees. And I knew. There was no evidence. I simply knew where they had gone. I started running. The air beneath the trees was colder than near the house. Water still fell from branches after an earlier rain. Mist clung to the upper slope. The farther I went, the stronger the old sensation returned. The silence, that same silence. The children came out of the trees before I reached the ridge. Emily looked completely normal. The other 3 did not. One boy was crying. A girl kept looking over her shoulder. They had been to the rift. In 22 years, it had widened enough for a child to step partly inside. Emily had gone closer than the others, but she had taken only one careful step into the opening. They could still see her back, arms, and legs. The bend in the passage remained well beyond her. Emily said she wanted to hear the echo from inside. Then something below made a sound like a slow breath. Long, deep, as though the mountain itself had inhaled. The light around Emily changed. The children were certain the forest did not become darker. The sun did not disappear behind clouds. Only Emily seemed farther away. The colors of her clothes faded. Her outline became less distinct, as though a great distance had opened between them, even though she was only a few feet away. She said, "That's strange. I can hear you from the other side, too." and vanished. She did not move deeper into the crack. She did not slip behind the wall. One moment she was there. The next, the entrance was empty. The children called her name. Their voices returned, stretched and distorted. 3 minutes later, Emily appeared on the same step, in the same position, and finished the sentence she had begun before disappearing. "Even though all of you are standing right in front of me." She could not understand why the others were screaming. For her, nothing had happened. When I questioned her later, she insisted she had never gone anywhere. She had never moved beyond the entrance. For a moment, she said, the other children simply looked very far away, but she could still see them. Those 3 minutes did not exist for her. That evening, I found fine gray grains beside her sneakers. I emptied one shoe over a newspaper. A small amount of gray sand fell out, the same color as the material inside the apple 22 years earlier. I said nothing to Claire. There was about an hour of daylight left, and I went to the rift alone. The slope had changed. Old spruce trees had fallen, and moss had retreated from the granite. The two rounded faces of rock were more exposed, narrowing toward the dark opening. The markings along the edges were clearer, too, one loop on the left, another on the right, both curving toward the blackness. I stepped farther back and saw the whole formation at once. The rock itself resembled an enormous version of the symbol. When we were children, roots and moss had hidden that resemblance. Now I could not tell which possibility was worse, that somebody had carved the symbol because the formation already looked that way, or that the rift had somehow grown to resemble the carving. The sun was dropping behind the mountain. The trees had gone still. No birds, no insects. Even the wind in the treetops had stopped. I switched on my flashlight. The beam entered the fissure. Wet rock, uneven ground, the bend. Near the farthest visible point, the light seemed to weaken. It did not reflect. It did not scatter. It simply disappeared. I said my daughter's name. "Emily," the rift answered. "Emily!" I was already turning away when another voice came from inside. Not an echo. Quiet. Very close. "Dad?" It was Emily. She was at the house, almost a mile away. I did not answer. I started walking back. A branch snapped behind me, then another, farther to my right. I stopped. The forest was completely silent. From somewhere behind me came a voice. "Matt!" Then again. "Mouse! Matt!" Daniel used to call me Mouse when we were children because I was small and quiet. Nobody else had ever called me that. I ran. When I reached the house, Emily was sitting calmly on the porch with Claire. At dinner, she stared at the kitchen wall and said the house seemed smaller on the inside than it was on the outside. Later, as she passed me without looking my way, she quietly said, "Matt? Mouse." When I asked what she had said, she looked confused. The next morning, Daniel arrived. Emily walked to him, took his left hand, then touched the exact place on his forearm where the pale pattern sometimes appeared. "Does it still show up here?" Daniel looked at me. That was something we had never told Claire. We had never told Emily. After lunch, Daniel and I walked toward the ridge. He stopped before the outcrop and refused to go farther. "It got bigger," he said. His left hand began to tremble. He pressed his fingers against a tree and said the bark felt soft. At the same moment, the pale pattern appeared beneath his skin. Then barking came from the rift. One short sound. Several seconds later, another, weak and distant, as though a dog were somewhere deep inside the mountain. Daniel turned around. We left New Hampshire the following morning. Later, I contacted the Forest Service and reported the fissure as a dangerous feature near an unofficial trail. 2 employees inspected it and described a natural vertical joint extending about 19 feet before bending out of sight. The report said nothing about the symbol. I called and asked whether they were certain they had inspected the same formation, 2 rounded granite faces with a vertical fissure between them. They confirmed it. When I asked about the curved carvings along the edges, the man paused. "There were no symbols on the rock," he said. "Emily grew up normally. She went to school, made friends, laughed, and never behaved like a child who had become someone else. But occasionally, she said, rooms felt the wrong size." Once, late at night, I heard her voice in the hallway. "Dad." Emily was asleep in her room. As I turned away from her door, the same voice whispered somewhere behind me, "Not this way." It did not happen often. Sometimes a year passed without anything strange. Claire and I took Emily to child psychologists more than once. They found no significant distress, no loss of contact with reality, and no reason for psychiatric treatment. She was a healthy child. I wanted to believe that meant the rift had left nothing behind. When Emily was 16, we were driving at night in heavy rain. Lightning flashed beyond the dark hills. She was watching the forest through the passenger window when she said, "The rift isn't getting wider, Dad." I asked what she meant. "We're getting closer to it." A few seconds later, she looked at me and did not remember saying either sentence. Years afterward, I found a popular science article about space-time, black holes, and hypothetical wormholes. One illustration showed a simplified Einstein-Rosen bridge, two curved regions facing one another, connected through a narrow throat with a point at the center. It was not identical to the carving in New Hampshire, but it was close enough. I closed the magazine and never returned to the article. Mostly I closed it because the resemblance brought back my guilt. I had brought Emily to that house and failed to keep her away from the one place I should have remembered. The psychologists had told us she was fine. I wanted to believe them. I still do. I am not claiming there was a wormhole in New Hampshire. I am not claiming that whoever carved those marks long before our time understood modern physics. But the article changed the way I saw the symbol. As children, we assumed the two curved shapes represented the two physical walls of granite. What if they did not? What if they represented two different places, two regions of space? What if the widening fissure was not separating those two sides? What if it was the connection forming between them? That was when Emily's words began to make a different kind of sense. The rift isn't getting wider. We're getting closer to it. Maybe the most important part of the carving had never been the two loops. Maybe it was the darkness between them, the rift itself. Daniel is 60 now. His arm works normally, but cold can still feel hot, and hard objects can briefly feel soft. The pale pattern still appears beneath his forearm. Emily is 33, with a normal life and a home of her own. She remembers standing at the entrance, but she still does not believe she disappeared. For her, those 3 minutes do not exist. About a month ago, Emily called me shortly after midnight. At first, it sounded ordinary. She asked whether I was awake. Then she went quiet. I heard faint static. "Dad," she said, "I think I finally understand what I heard back then." Then another sound appeared somewhere behind her, a low, prolonged groan. Emily stopped talking, and I heard a second voice, also hers, but lower, stretched, as though it had traveled through hundreds of feet of stone. "The two sides are almost touching." The call ended. I called back immediately. Emily answered on the first ring, sleepy and confused. She said she had been in bed for hours and had not called me. The call was still in my history. 4 minutes and 7 seconds. The next morning, Daniel sent me a photograph of his forearm. The symbol had appeared again. But this time the two pale curves seemed closer together, and the small point in the center was almost black. I have never returned to the White Mountains. I do not know whether the rift still exists or how wide it is now. I do not know whether the old story about the native settlement was true or who carved the marks along the fissure. Sometimes I think about the Forest Service employees. Maybe they simply failed to notice the carving, or maybe by the time they arrived, there was nothing left to see. I have also spent years thinking about Wes's old story, about people trying to keep something from coming through. Maybe we misunderstood that too. Maybe there was never anything living inside. Maybe the danger was not a creature or a spirit waiting under the mountain. Maybe they were trying to keep the rift itself from opening, not to keep two walls of granite together, to keep two other sides apart, two places that were never supposed to touch. Everything we deliberately put into the rift came back. The stones, the compass, the apple, and even Scout came back the first time. But whenever the rift returned something, it changed. And my daughter disappeared for only 3 minutes. For her, no time passed at all. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if she had taken not one step into that opening, but two. What lay beyond the bend where our flashlights could no longer reach. And more than anything else, I wonder what will happen when the two sides finally touch. This was the first story from 6 collections. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds. To be continued. The Men Who Disappeared at Black Spruce Cabin. Location: Interior, Alaska. Approximate year: August 2019. I am 45 now. 7 summers ago, 4 men disappeared from an old exploration cabin in the Alaskan interior. Search crews eventually found part of one of them. His left leg was lying in wet grass behind a collapsed generator shed, still inside his boot. The separation was so clean that one of the state troopers later told me it looked less like an injury and more like something from an anatomy textbook. There was almost no blood around it. The rest of Curtis Lane was never found. Neither were Nate Bell, Roy Jensen, or Miguel Santos. I was the 5th man who spent that night at Black Spruce Cabin. I am the only one who came back. By the summer of 2019, I had been working as a field geologist for long enough that remote assignments no longer felt adventurous. They were work. We collected rock samples, mapped old claims, checked mineralized zones identified from aerial surveys, and spent days walking through country that looked impressive on satellite imagery and mostly consisted of mosquitoes, wet boots, alder, and rocks when you were actually standing in it. That August, a small exploration company out of Anchorage hired our crew to inspect several old prospects east of the Alaska Range. There had been activity there in the 70s and early 80s, but very little since. Old records mentioned quartz veins, minor gold values, and elevated arsenic in stream sediment. Nothing that would make anyone rich, just enough to justify sending 5 people into the field for 6 days. Our team leader was Nate Bell. Nate was 46, careful, experienced, and almost irritatingly difficult to surprise. If Nate told you the weather was safe, he had already checked 3 forecasts. Curtis Lane was our equipment technician. Roy Jensen handled logistics and sampling. Miguel Santos managed GPS data and field mapping. I handled structural measurements and documentation. We carried a satellite phone, 2 satellite messengers, GPS units, first aid kits, bear spray, a 12-gauge shotgun, emergency food, water filters, rain gear, and enough equipment to make getting lost embarrassing. I mention that because when people hear what happened, they usually look for the easiest explanation. Bad preparation, alcohol, drugs, 5 inexperienced men panicking in the wilderness. That was not us. A bush plane dropped us beside an abandoned gravel strip on the morning of August 23rd. The weather was warm for that part of Alaska, around 60 degrees. Cloudy but dry. Fireweed still grew purple along the open ground, and the lower country was dense with willow, alder, and black spruce. From the landing strip, we followed the remains of an old mining road north. Parts of it were still obvious. Other sections had almost disappeared into brush. The first day was completely normal. We sampled 2 creek exposures, camped beside a gravel bar, cooked dinner, complained about mosquitoes, and went to sleep while there was still a little light over the western ridges. The next morning, Nate showed us an old survey map. Our route toward the second prospect passed close to a cabin built during exploration work in 1977. Later crews had used it occasionally. A report from 2012 described the structure as weathered but sound. Roof intact, door intact, bunks inside. There was also supposed to be an old outhouse and a small generator shed. The cabin sat almost exactly where we intended to stop for the night. There was a chance of heavy rain after midnight. Sleeping under a roof sounded better than setting tents in wet brush. So we changed the plan. The first few hours were ordinary. Then, sometime after lunch, the forest became quiet. I noticed because the mosquitoes disappeared. That sounds like a good thing until it happens all at once. For most of the morning, they had been everywhere, around our faces, inside our cuffs, following us whenever we stopped. Then I realized I had not slapped at one in several minutes. A little later, I noticed the birds were gone too. No ravens, no chickadees, no distant woodpecker, nothing moving through the brush. Even the breeze seemed to have stopped. The 5 of us were following a narrow drainage through spruce and willow when I stopped walking. Miguel nearly bumped into my pack. "What?" I listened. "I don't hear anything." He smiled at first. Then he listened too. Roy, who was behind him, laughed. "Enjoy it. Maybe the mosquitoes finally got tired of us." Nate looked up into the trees. He did not say anything. We continued. A northern forest can become quiet. Weather changes, animals move, bird activity rises and falls. There was nothing supernatural about silence. I knew that. But after another mile, I began experiencing a sensation I have never been able to describe properly. It felt as though someone else had joined us, not someone I could hear, not someone I could see. Just the persistent impression that our group was larger than it should have been. 5 men would stop. Something else seemed to stop. We would start walking again. The feeling moved with us. Every few minutes, I looked back. There was never anyone there, only the narrow path we had pushed through the brush. Wet leaves, spruce trunks, dark ground beneath the trees. Once I thought I saw a branch moving 30 or 40 yards behind us. I watched it until it became still. No animal appeared. I told myself a piece of alder had sprung back after Roy's pack brushed against it. That explanation worked, for maybe 10 minutes. We reached the cabin shortly after 6. The old survey maps called the place Camp 21, but someone had nailed a small wooden board beside the door years later. Black Spruce Cabin had been burned into it by hand. The cabin stood in a shallow clearing above the drainage. The logs were dark with age. The metal roof was rusted but intact. There were 2 small windows and a heavy wooden door. 20 yards behind it stood an outhouse. Farther downhill, brush had grown through what remained of the generator shed. Curtis walked around the building first. No bear damage. Nate checked the chimney, even though we had no reason to use the stove unless the rain made the night unusually cold. I went inside with Miguel. The cabin smelled of dry timber, old smoke, dust, and something faintly sour that I assumed came from mice. There were 4 wooden bunks, 2 against each wall, and a narrow cot beside the window. A table stood near the center. An old iron stove occupied one corner. Someone had left canned food, a broken lantern, and several paperback novels on a shelf. On one of the walls, previous visitors had written names and dates in pencil. 1988, 1994, 2003, 2012. Nothing strange. We checked the bunks for droppings, brought our packs inside, and cooked dinner on our own camp stove outside the door. By 8, clouds had thickened over the mountains. The evening light went gray. Miguel sent our coordinates through one of the satellite messengers. Nate made the scheduled call to Anchorage and told the office we were spending the night at the cabin. That call later became one of the most important facts in the search. People knew exactly where we were. Nobody had to guess. We sat outside for another hour. Curtis told a story about a drilling crew near Nome that had lost an entire pallet of sample bags because someone forgot to close the helicopter cargo net. Roy accused him of being the person who forgot. Curtis denied it. Miguel laughed hard enough to spill coffee onto his pants. Those are the memories I try to keep, not what happened later, those ordinary hours. 5 men sitting outside an old cabin while daylight slowly faded behind the trees. Around 10:30, the first drops of rain began hitting the roof. We went inside. Nobody lit the wood stove. The cabin was warm enough. We opened the vent above the door and used 2 battery lanterns while we organized equipment for the morning. By 11:30, everyone was tired. Nate and Miguel took the bunks along the far wall. Roy took the lower bunk opposite them. Curtis climbed into the bunk above Roy. I took the narrow cot beside the window. 1 lantern remained on the table at its lowest setting. The rain became steady. For a while, hearing it on the metal roof actually made me feel better. The forest was no longer completely silent. I remember Curtis snoring. I remember Roy telling him to roll over. I remember Nate saying something about leaving early if the rain stopped before dawn. Then I fell asleep. Sometime later, I woke up. I had no idea what time it was. The lantern on the table had gone out. The rain had weakened to a soft tapping against the roof. For a few seconds, I simply lay there. Then I heard Curtis climbing down from the bunk. The floor creaked under his weight. I heard him put on his boots. Then the door opened. He stepped outside. The door closed. I assumed he was going to the outhouse. I turned toward the wall. A minute or 2 passed. Then I heard footsteps. They were coming through the wet grass beside the cabin. Slow, heavy enough that I assumed they belonged to Curtis. The footsteps moved past the wall behind my head. Then they stopped directly outside the window beside my cot. 3 quiet taps touched the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I opened my eyes. My first thought was that Curtis was trying to scare me. He had spent most of the evening making jokes. I nearly turned toward the window. Something stopped me. To this day, I cannot explain what. I stayed facing the wall. 3 more taps came from the glass. Tap, 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 exactly the same rhythm. I waited for Curtis to laugh. Nothing. Then the footsteps began again. They moved toward the front of the cabin. The door latch lifted, very slowly. The hinges gave a soft creak. The door opened. Cool, damp air entered the room. Then the door closed. I waited for Curtis to walk back to his bunk. There were no footsteps. The cabin floor was impossible to cross silently. Even shifting your weight made those old boards complain. I listened. Nothing. I could hear rain dripping from the roof. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric when I moved one hand beneath my blanket. But there was no sound from Curtis. I told myself I must have drifted halfway back to sleep. Maybe I had missed him climbing into bed. It was the only explanation I had. So I turned over. I wish I had not. There are pieces of the next few seconds that remain perfectly clear. The table. The dark rectangle of the doorway, a strip of gray light at the window, the outline of the old iron stove, a water bottle lying on its side beneath Roy's bunk. I remember all of those things. What I cannot remember properly is what occupied the space between them. I know something was inside the cabin. I know I looked directly at it. But the memory will not remain whole. That is not a dramatic way of saying I refuse to describe it. I have tried. For years. I remember an impression of something too high and then immediately become uncertain that height had anything to do with it. I remember thinking part of it was close to the floor. Sometimes I think I saw a face. Sometimes I am certain there was nothing there that should be called a face. The harder I try to reconstruct it, the more the memory breaks into unrelated pieces. Doctors later called that a trauma response. Maybe they were right. What I remember clearly is everything around it. Curtis's bunk was empty. That was not surprising. He had gone outside. Roy's bunk was empty too. So were Nate's and Miguel's. Their blankets were still there. Their boots were still beside the bunks. And something was between me and the door. Whatever I saw created one thought so immediate that I did not reason my way toward it. Get out! That is the last complete memory I have from inside Black Spruce cabin. The next thing I remember is running. I was in the forest. Rain was falling hard. I had no boots, no jacket, no flashlight. I was wearing a t-shirt, lightweight sleep pants, and socks. I have no memory of opening the cabin door, no memory of crossing the clearing, no memory of deciding which direction to go. I was simply running. Branches hit my face. Alder tore at my clothes. Wet ground slipped beneath my feet. I fell again and again. Each time I got back up. I never looked behind me. That part is absolute. Whatever I had seen in the cabin had left one instruction in my mind, stronger than pain, fear, or common sense. Do not turn around. Nothing chased me. That is what frightened me most. I heard no footsteps behind me, no branches breaking, no breathing, no voice calling my name. Only rain. And underneath it, that same feeling from the afternoon. Something knew where I was. It did not need to run. At some point, I crossed the drainage and fell down an embankment. My right shoulder struck a rock. I heard something crack. Later, doctors told me I had fractured my collarbone. I kept moving. The soles of my socks were gone by then. My feet were cut badly enough that I was leaving blood on rocks, though I did not feel much of it at the time. Eventually, I reached an old service road. I recognized the drainage ditch and the remains of wooden culverts from the map. I turned downhill. After that, my memories become scattered. Rain, gray sky, walking, crawling for a while because my ankle would no longer support me. Then nothing. A telecommunications contractor found me shortly after 9 the next morning. He was driving an ATV toward a microwave repeater several miles down the road. I was lying partly in the ditch. He later told police I was conscious, but barely. I kept asking him whether anything had followed me out of the trees. I remember none of that. I was flown to Fairbanks. I had a broken collarbone, a severe ankle sprain, multiple cuts, mild hypothermia from spending the night soaked in the rain, and a concussion. None of those injuries explained what had happened to the others. Our Anchorage office reported the crew overdue that morning after Nate failed to make the scheduled satellite check-in. Because he had given them the cabin coordinates the previous evening, the search focused there immediately. A helicopter reached the clearing before noon. The rain had stopped. Inside the cabin, almost everything remained exactly where we had left it. Our packs, food, sampling equipment, GPS units, the shotgun, satellite phone, both satellite messengers. My boots were beside the cot. Nate's boots were beside his bunk. So were Roy's and Miguel's. Their rain jackets were hanging from pegs near the door. Curtis's boots were gone. So was the light jacket he had worn when he stepped outside. There was no sign of a fight, no overturned table, no broken furniture, no bullet damage, no large amount of blood. The rescuers initially assumed the 4 men had gone outside to look for me. That would have made sense, except 3 of them appeared to have gone barefoot or in socks. And none had taken a flashlight, radio, rain jacket, bear spray, or weapon. Heavy rain during the night had turned the clearing to mud and washed away most useful tracks. Searchers could still see disturbed areas near the cabin, but there were too many overlapping impressions to determine who had gone where. My own route could be followed intermittently because I had broken branches and left blood in several places. There was no comparable trail for the others. Then one of the searchers checked behind the collapsed generator shed. That was where they found Curtis's leg. It lay in flattened grass about 30 yards from the cabin. The boot was still tied. His sock was still inside it. The leg had been separated above the knee. There were no animal bites, no tearing that suggested a bear, no obvious drag marks. And despite the rain, investigators expected at least some evidence of major blood loss nearby. They found almost none. DNA later confirmed it belonged to Curtis. The condition of the separation became one of the strangest parts of the investigation. One examiner believed some type of powered cutting equipment might have been involved, but we had carried nothing capable of making that kind of cut. The old generator shed contained no machinery. The generator itself had been removed decades earlier. Another investigator told me privately that he could not identify conventional saw marks. I once asked a state trooper what he thought had happened. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I can tell you what didn't do it. A bear didn't do that." Search teams remained in the area for 9 days. Helicopters flew the valleys. Dogs worked the old roads. Ground teams searched creeks, ravines, abandoned prospect pits, and every structure marked on historic surveys. They found nothing else. No clothes, no equipment, no blood trail, no bodies. Nate Bell, Roy Jensen, and Miguel Santos simply disappeared. Officially, investigators considered several possibilities: an animal encounter, a violent dispute inside the group, disorientation caused by darkness and weather. They even considered whether someone else had been living illegally in the area. None of those theories fit everything. A bear could make men run. It could not explain why 3 experienced field workers left without boots, lights, jackets, radios, or bear protection. A stranger could hurt someone. But there was no evidence another camp existed anywhere nearby, and nobody could explain Curtis's leg. Then they questioned me. I told them about the silence during the hike, the feeling that someone was following us, Curtis leaving the cabin, the footsteps, the tapping on the window, the door opening. Then they asked what I saw when I turned around. I tried to answer. My heart rate climbed until the monitor beside my hospital bed started alarming. My hands shook so badly I could not hold a cup. According to the nurse, I stopped speaking and stared at the wall for almost a minute. The same thing happened during a later interview. After that, they stopped pushing. For several weeks, I remained in Fairbanks recovering. My collarbone began healing. My feet were stitched and bandaged. The concussion symptoms faded. But every night I dreamed about the cabin. Never about what I had seen. Even in the dreams, that part remained missing. I dreamed about the window. 3 taps, always 3. Then the door opening. And no footsteps afterward. About 2 months after the disappearance, I was back in Anchorage for physical therapy. One evening, I was sitting beside the window in my second-floor room. The sun had already gone down. Cars moved through the parking lot below. Beyond the lights was a narrow strip of spruce separating the building from another road. I noticed someone standing between the trees. A man. At least I thought it was a man. He was too far away to identify. He did not move. I watched him for maybe 10 seconds. A nurse entered. I turned my head to answer her. When I looked back, nobody was there. I told myself it was someone waiting for a ride. The next morning, another nurse raised the blind and noticed something resting on the exterior window ledge. The window was sealed. It did not open. Maintenance eventually reached the ledge from outside. What they recovered was part of a human finger. Police assumed it was some kind of grotesque prank. Then the DNA results came back. It belonged to Miguel Santos. Miguel had been missing for almost 2 months. No other part of him was ever recovered. The ledge was more than 20 feet above the ground. Security cameras covered the parking lot and the main approaches to that side of the building. Investigators reviewed the footage. Nobody climbed beneath my room. No ladder appeared. No vehicle stopped there during the relevant period. Nobody ever explained how the tissue reached the ledge. That detail was never widely released. Miguel's disappearance was still an active investigation. His family wanted privacy. The hospital refused to discuss it, and I wanted nothing to do with reporters. I left Alaska the following year. I still work in geology, but from an office now. I review survey data, drilling reports, and maps. I got married. I have a daughter. For several years, nothing else happened. No tapping, no figures outside windows, no pieces of anyone. Gradually, I managed to convince myself that whatever happened was tied to that place. Black Spruce cabin, that drainage, that particular patch of forest. Then last month, my phone rang at 2:13 in the morning. I slept through it. The number was blocked. There was a voicemail, 22 seconds long. For the first 14 seconds, there was only faint static. Then came 3 sounds: tap, 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 on glass. After that, someone breathed close to the microphone. Then I heard Curtis. He said one word. Not my real name. A nickname. It came from a stupid mistake I had made on the first afternoon of that trip. Roy invented it. Miguel repeated it. By dinner, all 4 men were using it. It never followed me home. Nobody in my family knew it. I never mentioned it to investigators. It appeared in no report or newspaper story. Only 5 people had ever heard it. 4 disappeared at Black Spruce Cabin. I listened to the recording once. I have not played it again. The cabin is still standing. After receiving the voicemail, I checked recent satellite imagery. The clearing is visible. So is the dark roof. There are no active exploration claims in that drainage now. No field camps, no maintained hiking trail, nothing that should bring people there. But eventually someone will go. A hunter, a survey crew, someone caught in heavy rain who finds the old cabin marked on a map and decides a roof is safer than sleeping outside. Maybe they will cook dinner. Maybe they will complain about mosquitoes. Maybe the woods around them will slowly become quiet. And sometime after midnight, one of them may wake up. Someone will leave the cabin. Footsteps will move around the outside wall. 3 taps will touch the glass. The door will open. And whoever is lying nearest the window will eventually turn around. People still ask me what I saw. I cannot tell them. I have stopped trying to recover that part of the memory. But I remember one thought very clearly. Earlier that afternoon, when the mosquitoes vanished and every bird went silent, we assumed the animals had moved away from that part of the forest. I do not believe that anymore. I think they were still there, I think they were hiding, and I think they knew before we did that something had started following us. This was the second story from 6 collections. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds. To be continued. The water keeps them. Location: Bitterroot Mountains, Montana, USA. Approximate year: 1998. In July of 1998, I went into the Bitterroot Mountains with an old man who claimed he could show me a lake that did not appear on any map. I never saw the lake. 6 days later, I came out of those mountains alone. For years, I told myself the old man had simply been a criminal, a hermit, maybe a lunatic who had spent too long away from people. That explanation worked for almost 20 years. Then, in 2017, I found his photograph in a Montana mining archive. The picture had been taken in 1904. He was decades younger in it, but there was no question in my mind. It was Elias Crowley. My name is Daniel Mercer. Back then, I was 31 and freelancing for a small outdoor magazine in Seattle, writing about fire lookouts, ghost towns, and old mining claims. I liked stories that were almost believable. That summer, I found 3 references to something called Crowley's Lake. The first was a 1911 newspaper clipping about 2 prospectors who disappeared west of the Bitterroot Valley. Their equipment was found beside a creek. They were not. The article said they had been searching for a remote lake where miners supposedly hid gold. The second reference came from a surveyor's diary written in 1926. He described meeting an old trapper who warned him away from an unnamed drainage. The trapper said, "Men go looking for Crowley's water when they want to get rich. The water keeps them instead." The third came from a retired Forest Service employee. He said the lake was somewhere near the Idaho line with no established trail and no place on official maps. That was enough for me. I arrived in Hamilton, Montana in the second week of July. The valley baked beneath summer haze and afternoon thunderheads. I spent 2 days asking questions. A bartender had heard the name. An older woman remembered her father mentioning it. An outdoor store clerk said people turned every unnamed pond into a legend eventually. Then I met Elias Crowley. I was eating breakfast in a diner when he sat 2 stools away. He was small, narrow through the shoulders, in faded canvas pants, old boots, and a pale long-sleeved shirt. His hair was almost white. His face looked somewhere between 70 and 90. He ordered black coffee, glanced at the Forest Service map beside my plate, and said, "You won't find it on there." What? The lake. I hadn't written Crowley's Lake anywhere on the map. What lake? The one you've been asking about. Hamilton wasn't big. I had been talking to people for 2 days. I told myself someone had mentioned me. Then he gave me his name, Elias Crowley. I laughed. He didn't. Was the lake named after your family? Something like that. He asked why I wanted to find it. I told him mining history, folklore, photographs, a magazine story. I never mentioned gold. He did. You're not the first man who came out here for that gold. I'm not looking for gold. No, you're looking for a story about men looking for gold. By the end of breakfast, he had offered to guide me there. I asked what he wanted. Company. He refused payment. 2 mornings later, someone dropped him at the trailhead. I never saw the driver. By 7, we were walking west through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The first day was beautiful. We crossed icy creeks, and by noon the forest smelled of pine resin, warm stone, and dust. Elias never seemed tired. I was 31 and fit. He looked at least 75, yet he kept the same pace uphill without breathing hard or asking to stop. That evening we camped beside a creek. I asked how long he had lived around the Bitterroots. Long enough. Then I asked about the gold. He said prospectors had worked those mountains around the turn of the century. One group disappeared. A second group went looking and vanished too. The lake, he said, sat in a bowl of dark rock above an old mining drainage. Some stories claimed sacks of gold had been thrown into the water. Others claimed the miners were still down there. Which version do you believe? Elias looked into the fire. Why does there have to be a difference? That night I woke because the forest had gone completely quiet. No insects, no creek, no wind. Elias stood beyond the firelight facing uphill. What are you doing? Listening? For what? Making sure we're alone. A minute later, the forest seemed to breathe again. The next morning, we left the established trail. From then on, I depended almost entirely on him. That afternoon, a thunderstorm hammered the canopy. 20 minutes later, sunlight returned and steam rose from the rocks. Elias stood in the rain without a jacket, looking upward like he had missed it. That night, I woke to sweet, bitter pipe smoke. Elias sat beside the dead fire with a tiny orange ember between his fingers. I had never seen tobacco among his things. On the 3rd day, I noticed old cuts in several trees, 2 horizontal lines with a vertical mark beneath them. Survey marks? No. What are they? Directions. To the lake? He kept walking. By mid-afternoon, the forest changed. The trees grew older and farther apart. Brown needles swallowed our footsteps. Then I found a rusted food tin, broken glass, and the remains of a boot. Most of the leather was gone, but several brass eyelets were green with corrosion. I photographed everything. People leave too much behind, Elias said. That evening we found a ruined cabin, rotten logs sunk into moss, a collapsed chimney, and square nails. Near the foundation I uncovered a corroded metal plate. One word was readable. Crowley. I turned. Elias was standing directly behind me. You knew this was here? Yes. Was this your family's camp? My father's. Your grandfather's? My father. Elias, this cabin is more than 100 years old. More. When was your father here? 1901. And when were you born? 1882. I laughed once. He didn't. I stood, suddenly aware of how far we were from anybody. You wanted the story, he said. My bottle had been empty for almost an hour. I still thought the age story was some elaborate joke, and I was badly overheated. Elias held out his canteen. You look overheated. I hesitated, then drank. The water tasted normal. A minute later, the sweet smell of tobacco became overwhelming. The trees tilted. My knees gave out. The last thing I remember was Elias catching my shoulder. When I woke, my wrists were tied behind a cedar and my ankles were bound. My backpack, camera, boots, and belt were gone. Elias sat nearby eating one of my energy bars. What did you give me? He ignored the question. You were too curious. I started shouting. He let me. No one comes this way anymore, he said. That was the point. What do you want? Nothing? Then untie me. No. Take the money. Take everything. I've got enough. Then he told me about the lake. His father had come into those mountains with 2 men in 1901. They found traces of gold and eventually reached the lake. After that, men kept coming with maps, rumors, and dreams of getting rich. His father learned that a man alone in the wilderness was easier to rob than a bank. Food, guns, cash, gold, equipment. What happened to them? They stayed. In the lake? Most? Then he told me he had killed his father in 1923. The old man forgot there only gets to be one owner. I told him that if he had been born in 1882, he was 116 years old. That's what the arithmetic says. You're insane. Probably. Then why bring me here at all? For the first time, he looked almost offended. I really was going to show it to you, Daniel. Then you started asking the right questions. I wish I had stopped there. Instead, I asked, "What's in the lake?" Something changed in his face. I don't know anymore. What does that mean? He looked toward the mountains. The water got deep. He stood and put on my pack. You're leaving me here? You said you wanted wilderness. He walked away. I shouted his name. He stopped once. You would have liked the lake. Then he disappeared between the trees. I stayed tied to that cedar until long after dark. A broken branch had grown into the trunk behind me. I worked the rope against its sharp end for hours until one hand finally came free. I had no boots, flashlight, food, map, or compass, so I followed water downhill. For the next 2 days, I followed the creek, drank from it, and ate huckleberries. By night, I shook beneath branches. The worst part wasn't being lost. It was the footsteps. Every few hours, I thought I heard someone behind me. Slow, unhurried. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. On the second night, I smelled that sweet pipe tobacco again. I ran barefoot through the dark until I fell into the creek. Nothing followed. On the third morning, I reached an old logging road. Late that afternoon, a Forest Service truck found me. I spent 4 days in the hospital with cut feet, infected wrists, and insect bites. The sheriff took my statement. Search teams found our first campsite and part of the drainage. After that, nothing matched what I remembered. No cabin, no marked trees, no Elias. Nobody in Hamilton knew an Elias Crowley. The diner waitress remembered an older man talking to me, but she couldn't describe his face clearly. Neither could I. I remembered white hair, gray eyes, and the bend in his shoulder, but not his nose, mouth, or ears. The sheriff decided I had been drugged, assaulted, and abandoned by a man using a false name. That explanation worked for 19 years. Then, in 2017, I found a digitized photograph labeled Crowley Prospecting Party, Bitterroot Range, 1904. 5 men. One of them was Elias. He looked decades younger, somewhere in his early 20s, but I recognized the narrow face, the eyes, and the slight bend in his left shoulder immediately. Seeing his face wasn't the same as remembering it. The photograph supplied details my mind still refused to. Under the photograph were 5 names. The last 2 were Thomas Crowley and Elias Crowley. The archive confirmed the glass plate existed. A historian found records showing Thomas and Elias had arrived around 1900. Both vanished from public records after 1923. No death certificates, no graves. There was one more document. A note attached to a 1914 mining survey described an unnamed lake nearby. The surveyor lowered 300 feet of line into it and never found the bottom. I have never gone back. But there is one last part. When search teams recovered my belongings in 1998, they were in a dry creek bed several miles from where, based on my memory of the route, I believed the ruins should have been. My backpack, my notebook, my boots, even my wallet. The camera was missing. 6 months later, a padded envelope arrived at the magazine office with no return address. Inside were strips of developed 35mm negatives and a set of prints. Most were mine. The trail, the creek, the cabin, Elias beside the fire. Then came 3 photographs I had never taken. One showed me unconscious beside the cedar. The second showed me tied to it. I gave the sheriff copies of the photograph showing Elias. They circulated it locally. Nobody recognized him, and no driver's license, property record, or voter registration existed under that name. The final frame was so underexposed, I thought it was blank. I took the negative to a lab and asked for the brightest usable print. There was water, black water, a mountain lake at night. The moon was reflected near the center. Just below it were pale shapes, dozens of them. I told myself they were rocks. On the far side of the photograph, Elias stood knee-deep in the lake, looking directly at the camera. And behind him, where the water should have reflected the mountains, there was no reflection at all. Only darkness. I burned that print. I wish I had burned the negatives too. For years, I assumed the package was a threat. Now, I'm not so sure. Maybe Elias expected me to survive. Maybe he didn't want the story buried. Maybe he only wanted the road to the lake buried. Every few years, usually in July, I think about the question I asked Elias. What's in the lake? And his answer, I don't know anymore. Maybe the Crowleys really found gold, or maybe they found something else first. Something that let a man born in 1882 still be walking those mountains at the age of 116. Something that made keeping its location secret worth killing for. And I still remember the sentence from that surveyor's diary. Men go looking for Crowley's water when they want to get rich. The water keeps them instead. Maybe that wasn't a warning about greed. Maybe it was literal. This was the 3rd story from the 6th collection. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds. To be continued.